Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the New Ground Life and Leadership podcast. Today, we're in another episode of our short series where we're talking about mission in the modern age. And for that, we have got the wonderful Lex Loizides with us again. Hello, Lex.
Hey, Jess. Great. Lovely to be with you again. Love the podcast. Love what you're doing.
That's great. I mean, you haven't got to say that every time we get you on, but I'm very grateful for it. It helps the encouragement. Today, Lex, we are wanting to talk specifically to people in churches who are involved in making leadership decisions for congregations and for the events and activities and the services that different churches put on, pastors, deacons, preaching teams, to talk specifically about how we can help foster and nurture growth among outsiders, particularly among the lost in our churches. You are in Cape Town, where you've been an elder, the longest serving elder, as we learned last time, longest serving elder on the team. But in 2016, planted or replanted or sited a new church in the central business district of the city, which has gone from being a congregation initially of 60 to just in a few short years to being around 300 people. And as an experienced church planter and as someone who has read lots on the subject and tried lots of different things on the subject, I thought it'd be great for us to talk about this. But first of all, Lex, why don't you just start by setting the scene better than I did just then? Cape Town, a city of something like 4.5 million people, I believe. Tell us about the city and some of what you've done in the last few years. Over to you.
Well, the pastor of Weinberg Baptist Church gets filled with the Holy Spirit, and there's a bit of a ruckus and a bit of a glory moment, and Jubilee is planted out of that church. Zoom forward another few years again, and this original Baptist church is struggling. And they approached us and asked us, would we like to kind of collaborate, join the two congregations together? There was around 40 people there. And we said, let's do it. Let's do it. So we joined together, called it Jubilee Community Church. City center churches are notoriously difficult. Not only getting the building would be practically impossible in most major city centers, but we managed to do a renovation inside the building. And although other groupings had struggled to get anything going there, by the grace of God, we were able to see good numbers coming from fairly early on. Realistically, it was probably more like 10 or 15 of the old Baptist church stayed with us, and they were largely elderly people who regularly attended a Wednesday lunchtime prayer meeting, and their prayers for the faithfulness of God to restore something in the city center was just outstanding. And really a building that could have been lost to developers and become like an office block with their apartments or whatever, by the grace of God, was preserved for the preaching of the gospel right in the heart of the city of Cape Town.
That's amazing. I think it is just worth a couple of stats on this that I dug out from Keller's book, The Center Church, where he just points out that we've got to the point where over 50% of the world's population now live in cities, compared to around 5% a couple of hundred years ago. And he says people are moving to cities at a much faster rate than the church is. In 1950, just 60 years ago, there were only 2 cities bigger than 10 million in population. Today, there are more than 20. So people are in the cities, people are moving to the cities. And Keller's drum that he beat for many years was, Christians, we mustn't neglect the cities at the very least. Which I think is a conversation for another time. But if you're planting in church and leading church in a city, you know some of the particular pressures that you face by the demographic and the urban center that you're in. But Lex, I'd love to just get your comments to kind of take us into some of your journey and some of the things you've done to grow the congregation there. How did so, as we've mentioned before, you've been involved in planting different types of churches and sites over the years. How do you think a lot of that informed and shaped your decision in how you approached this opportunity that came about? Because as we've just alluded to, it's very hard to grow churches in cities. And so, well, yeah, tell us about that, your journey towards taking on this opportunity.
I think wanting to learn was a key thing. One of the things that did surprise me initially was that although Keller had given a strong emphasis on city dwellers versus suburbanites, I didn't think that would be an issue when it came to Cape Town, because like a city like Boston, Cape Town, you can kind of walk through the city center, and the suburbs aren't an hour and a half away on a train. It's all pretty close, clustered in towards the mountain and then spreading out beyond the mountain, which is, of course, arguably where the center of the population is, probably further away from the mountain. But what I did find was that the city dwellers, those who lived within the city bowl, in the kind of within a kilometer or two of the central business district, really did have a kind of city identity that wasn't the suburbs. So there was this kind of particular feel. And then I read a book by Donnie Griggs called Small Town Jesus, and he's been on your podcast, of course. And he talked about small town stuff that I thought, wow, this reminds me of Greenwich Village in Manhattan. People who live in Greenwich Village, that they're in a neighborhood, they're in a cluster of neighborhoods, and they do business with one another and they know one another. And maybe that's how we should see ourselves as a congregation, like properly rooted in the city. So I think I did need to make that adjustment, that actually there is a separate identity within a city center, and celebrate that, see that as an advantage rather than a disadvantage. So the road that we're in is called Clough Street. And so a lot of what we did was kind of identifying with that geography. So I would put on occasional events that we called Clough Street Conversations. So we'd invite different ones in to an event, but it would be under the banner of a Clough Street Conversation, because we talk about our congregation as the Clough Street congregation, like the old Baptists used to do. I don't know if you know any of the old Baptist churches in the UK. They were known by their street names. So trying to recognize that there is a kind of identity in town or in the city, and actually become part of it rather than flatten everything, try and flatten things and resist that observation. I think Keller was right about that. I'm not sure about all culture coming from city centers into the burbs, but certainly there is a cultural
understanding
hub.
the identity that they have.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it's interesting. I recently visited Pete and Sarah Benton in Berlin, and he talks about Berlin as being a makeup of lots of different neighborhoods. I think they call them Kutzes. And so he's talking about different ways that they can identify as Berliners, yes, but more specifically their particular neighborhood within the city. And I guess you have that when you are part of a city. You celebrate the fact that I'm a Londoner, but really it's Bow or the East End or whatever part of London that you're in. You think, well, that's my community, because ultimately, I suppose, as human beings, as social creatures, we can only identify and relate to so many people. And if we're just global citizens, if you like, we're citizens of nowhere, and that gives us a sense of detachment and insecurity. So you've got to ground people's identity and celebrate who they are, what they're from, where they're from, rather. And so talk to us about your initial goals then for the congregation. You take on this congregation in this new district, this new area, embracing perhaps this is going to be a slow burn to pass the people over 20 years and see a marginal growth. What were some of your goals stepping into a place like that?
I tried to keep it simple. And so I'd said numerous times in those early years, we've got two goals. That's all, just two things that we're trying to do. First of all, we want to learn about our city. We want to learn about the history of the city, and we want to learn about its current reality for different people. And that means, of course, listening to different people's experience of the history of the city, which in a nation like South Africa, in a town like Cape Town or Joburg, it's very, very important that we are learning about the city that we're part of. We're not just kind of arriving and rebuking and overturning, and we're not saying, aha, now we've arrived. It's not that at all. We want to learn about it, and that learning emphasis meant we could learn about the city's creativity and its cultural strengths. That's one of the things that when I met with Peter Benton in Berlin with his leadership team, we did a Zoom call. It's like, love the cultural strengths of Berlin, love the cultural kind of icons, learn about them, just for yourself, enjoy the strengths of creative gifts even that have come out of your city or your nation, so that you're really genuinely thrilled to be part of something that's producing cultural good. That means literary events. It means get into the art galleries, go and have a look, enjoy the locally produced music, go to the jazz clubs, you know, see what's happening in terms of theater, the arts, sport, all of those kind of things. So I wanted to encourage a kind of learning or listening posture, not merely a corrective one, because I think if you go in with a corrective one, you can just obviously come across as obnoxious. That also means that you could be seen or misunderstood to be engaging with issues that are considered by some as more political or ethical. And why aren't you doing evangelism? Why are you focusing on things that aren't directly evangelistic? Well, and the answer to that is because our first goal is to learn about our city and the history of our city. For us, in terms of putting on events, it meant curating events and experiences that expose our people to that knowledge about the history of the city and of other people's experiences, whether woundedness or successes that they'd had in the city as well. So, and that also gave me an opening to be able to invite in not just Christians, but non-believers to help us understand the city as well.
That's really good. I guess for us in the UK, we've got like the blue plaques, haven't we? Famous people who lived here.
Oh, yeah.
And knowing your city's, the things that your city or your neighborhood are proud of, and being proud of them with them, celebrating that. And that requires time. That's not something you can necessarily get from a book. You've got to have conversations with neighbors. You've got to spend time in cafes. You've got to make it feel like you love this place, just like the residents do. Again, Keller talks about before you challenge the culture, you've got to make sure you properly enter it. So it's that full immersing yourself in the city.
Well, the listening thing, I'll come on to the second goal now. The listening thing, I think, is so helpful. Like, we did things like, I visited District 6, the District 6 Museum. I got chatting with someone at one of the book festivals who was like an influencer, not on Instagram, but in the academy amongst architects, and kind of an observer in terms of creating equal, fair city spaces for all the city's population. And in fact, I invited her to come and do our very first Cliff Street conversation, where she read a section from her book and talked about how apartheid had created a geographical separation deliberately, and how city planners are thinking to change some of those things into the future. For me, that's all very relevant because of that first goal of wanting to learn about where we've been, where we could be going as well.
One of the things that I have always appreciated about your ministry, whether from afar or up close, is your emphasis on the importance of personal evangelism, giving out tracts, having gospel conversations with people. You share wonderfully in sermons stories of praying with people or trying to share prophetic words with non-Christians and things. And of course, that's an incredibly important aspect of evangelistic ministry. But I suppose what you're talking about here, for the moment, you haven't said anything necessarily about trying to have direct gospel conversations. How much, how do you see, how important do you see this sort of missional type, missionary experience of entering a culture? And how do you get the balance between what we might call friendship listening evangelism and proclamation, direct witnessing evangelism?
Yeah, brilliant question. Because if you were going to plant a church, I don't know, let's just pick anywhere, say in the middle of Japan, you would put in the hours, wouldn't you? I would, reading the history, finding out if there's some history of Christianity in the nation, or perhaps in the city or close to the city, you'd learn the language, you would try and I read this phrase from somewhere, I can't remember who said it, you do some cultural archaeology. I love that. You do some digging, which actually probably does mean reading. I think reading about the history of South Africa, what before I came to South Africa, and also then after being here, was particularly helpful because I received a number of shocks as a British person, shocks that I needed to experience before kind of actually it's experiencing the current reality of where we're at. So I think all that background, whether it's in the political realm or whether it's in the arts or whether it's in the current kind of makeup of a city, which you get by going to the cafes and doing all of that, I think that's all really important, isn't it? I mean, it's good to listen before you speak. I suppose there's that. You know, it's good to listen to what someone's issues are before you say, the gospel has an answer for that. Otherwise, you might just misfire. But the second goal, of course, is to make a specifically Christian contribution to the city. And for us, that meant making sure, as far as we could, that the Sunday experience was really a good one, that, you know, every part of that had been thought through carefully, and that the goal of our Sunday moments are that people would encounter God, that the believer would encounter God, both emotionally and subjectively during the time of worship when we're singing or hearing gifts of the Spirit, and through hearing the word of God preached as well. We want the believer to encounter God, but we also want the non-believer to encounter God as well. And so that kind of framing of the Sunday moment is important. And then we wanted to establish healthy midweek small groups, as most churches do, and then provide other contexts for people to grow in their faith and so on.
That's good. I guess it's important that as much as we talked about number one, it's important that churches don't lose sight of number two, because otherwise you do just end up in the slightly more social liberal arm of the church that is trying to discern felt needs and meet those needs, forgetting the fact that the primary distinctive of the church is that it is a church, a community of people called out to give up all other gods and idols except for Christ and to proclaim him in his resurrection. But I guess even in talking about putting on a positive Sunday experience, what's your kind of reflections on the conversation between being a missional, outsider oriented church on the one hand and being fully charismatic and open to the gifts of the Spirit on the other? What's your some reflections on that conversation that seems to take place in various settings?
We must remember that the whole reason we planted this church was actually to try and increase the word of God's influence in the town that we planted in. And so that needs to be very much a part of it. You're reminding me of a story that someone from a non-Christian from Cape Town who was connected to someone in Jubilee told us this story. They visited a church, a charismatic, actually it was a New Frontiers church in the UK, and they got quite unnerved in the service, not by the fact that someone had brought a tongue or an interpretation or whatever else had happened in the meeting, and it was a larger meeting, but by the sense that no one's in charge, that no one seems to be leading this. And what the initial response of the believer who's hearing this, he thought it was, it's the charismatic, it puts the non-Christian off. Actually, it wasn't that. It was the sense of disorder that made the person feel insecure. And I think almost, Paul talks about that very thing when he says, God's not a God of disorder, but a God of peace. So let everything be done in order. Otherwise, we misrepresent the character of God to not only to the believers, but to the non-believer. So it's not the charismatic that puts people off. I think if you were visiting, I don't know, a Hindu temple, you wouldn't necessarily be thrown by the strangeness of something that's happening in there. And I think when people come to our churches, they do need to feel a sense of this is organized, this is done well. It could be a very long, unexplained gap between two songs that makes someone think, well, what, look around and everyone's like, they're still in the moment. And they're like, well, what's going on? And I don't think that means you've got to explain everything every 5 seconds. Not that, but just let's work hard at putting on services that really work well for both the believer and the non-believer. I don't think we need to get white-knuckled about the other stuff. Sorry, that's a long answer.
No, I love that. And I think that's a really important contribution to the conversation that we can often overlook, the need for effective leadership. So in planting, establishing this church, we've talked about listening. We've talked about listening and learning about the city. We talked about then making sure that we make a specifically Christian contribution to the city. Then talked about what you do differently. What are some of the things that you think have caused the spike in growth and encouragement that you've seen, Sundays and various things that you're up to?
Okay, well, obviously, and I don't mean this flippantly, but I do think those early years, two of the older ladies have passed away now, but I think the passionate prayer of faithful older Baptist women, like not worried about denominationalism, but crying out to God to revive his work and to sustain a place where Jesus will be proclaimed in the center of the city. I just think that was a massive thing. And but I think we also did try and do some like slightly innovative things. So we just created this idea of doing inserts. And when we started them, it was just interviews with people in the congregation, not spectacular testimonies necessarily, but just getting to know one another. And it was a community builder. So when you met that person afterwards for coffee, it's like, oh yeah, so when did you start teaching chemistry at the school or whatever it was? So they weren't necessarily high flying type. But then also, of course, people started coming. I'm very pro the arts. So we had, different artists coming, and we've got, a tremendous South African playwright part of I only learned that she was one of the top Afrikaans playwrights when someone who was with me saw her name serving in the kids' work and said, that can't be that person.
Wow.
And, so things like that have happened. We had a jazz singer joined us, and then I interviewed her. How did you get into this? We played a little clip from her on the TV, and then she performed something to a backing track. Ken Walton, who's the part owner of Truth Coffee, which has been voted the best coffee shop in the world several times. He's in our congregation, and he's a hospitality guru. So I was talking about, so what's the dynamics? How do you make it work? And all of that, and how can we relate that to, how we do things? So those inserts have kind of added a kind of testimonial value, I suppose. I'm just making this up now, to the service. So it's not just the worship, then the preach, and little creativity going in. We plan the insert every single week.
And I think there's something there about just generally congregation size. Once you get above a certain size of congregation, you can't know everybody. You can't be expected to know everybody. And yet one of the primary things that we love about belonging to a church is that it's a family of people we know. So the more we can do to help people feel as though they know and are known by different people just creates the stickiness to the culture of the church, which is really helpful.
Exactly. It's also a place that you can use for when we have baptisms or when we're welcoming people into membership, or baby thanks, or a testimony of healing. We had a lady, Elaine Chips, who was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. We prayed. She went through the process. She was given 4 months to live. Praise God. She's totally declared in remission. Wow. And she's living a completely healthy life. I mean, that was a great insert to do. We also used what we called, or what Lester, my colleague, called a pocket apologetics, where we We took 10 objections, the main 10 objections to the Christian faith over 10 Sundays for 10 minutes. And we recorded them. They're all on YouTube. And we just went through it. So for just over 10 weeks, we couldn't quite fit one into every single week. That actually drew people. So is there any evidence that God exists? Why is there suffering then? Isn't Christianity a white man's religion? You know, all of those different, what about science? All of those different kind of objections that people raised, we did. Now, they were little top heavy in terms of those weeks, because you've got 10 minutes of fairly condensed apologetics and then a sermon. But in our congregation, it worked, it was fine. One of the things that we did as well is we bought a proper state-of-the-art coffee machine. I mean, like, which needs baristas to operate it. And we offer that coffee free. It takes longer. We also do good bean coffee in a percolator as well. But before the service, from around 9:30, the baristas are serving, volunteer baristas. And one of our guys is training guys so that if they go for an interview for a job as a barista, they can say, well, I've already done a year, you know, every Sunday or something like that. So we have volunteer baristas serving, and who doesn't want to be a barista anyway, serving the coffee before the service. And then often at the end of a service, I'll say, look, the service is finished, but church hasn't finished. So this is a social context where it's acceptable for you to go up to someone that you don't know and say, hi, my name's David. What's your name? You're allowed to do that in Jubilee. So our baristas are ready to serve you. You don't have to rush away. Obviously, we've got all the normal things, like we've got a welcome table. There's a free book for first-time guests. And the goal in that interaction isn't to get data filled out in a form or online. It's conversation and learning one another's stories, so that there's the human kind of connection. But the actual overall, if you like, then service is actually from 9:30, sometimes till around 1, when people leave. And with a congregation where there's a lot of professionals who are singles, like my congregation, it's the families who tend to need to get going after the service, not necessarily the singles. So it's a tremendous opportunity for actually making friends and trying to break down this idea that, well, on Sunday we don't make friends. That happens in the small group. Well, why not? Friendships can start anywhere.
Yeah, and so, I suppose when you're in the city as well, people have traveled often a long time to get there.
Sure.
And they're not necessarily going to dash away. Again, my friends in Istanbul would say people would travel 2 hours to be there, 2 hours back, and they're not going to see each other in the week. So you've got to maximize the opportunity you've got of gathering together. And we're not just putting on a service, but creating church as a community and as a place for relating to each other.
Oh, I think it's really important.
Well, there's we're almost out of time, so we're going to get one of your top things that you would recommend, or things that you've done. I know that some of all the resources and things that you've thought about, we'll put in the links to today, including the history of videos on the history of your congregation, 10 minutes to truth videos, which is the evangelistic apologetics thing you were talking about. But what would be something that you really want to another thing that's really helped you that you want to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, it could be that there's a niche thing in your village or in your town or in your city that would just not fly as a generic invitation. So we did a February the 14th, Valentine's Day thing called In Love in Verse. And it was kind of a history of, through English literature mainly, there were some other English translations from Sutu and other things, of, you know, daft attempts to win. You know, most of Shakespeare's sonnets are like, hey, you know, you're going to die, so let's have a baby together and then your beauty will live on. Like a pickup line that surely never worked. But, you know, there's lots of like humorous attempts at love and so on, and put those all together into a package. For me, that was, I mean, it was a great event. It was sold out quite quickly. Not because it was generally of interest to the church, because it isn't that kind of thing sonnets by Shakespeare, John Donne, Andrew Marvell, who cares about that? But for some people, oh, that's immediately interesting. And their non-Christian friends who are already into, say, poetry, I'm talking about poetry now, would be interested in it. So maybe there's a niche thing in your village or in your town that you are good at. And if you're not good at it, maybe it's, I don't know what it would be, a sport or something, you know, get good at it, learn, develop a new skill, and then see if you can't put something on that would invite people who are really interested in that thing. I mean, one young guy says to me, he's a married guy, actually, he's in his 40s, he's not that young. He says, I want to do a games event, a board games event. It'll be great. And I thought, oh no, that would be terrible. I said, well, okay, so really, do you think there'll be lots of people that would be interested? If loads of people would be interested, it would be great. When do you want to do it? Straight after church on one Sunday. Straight after church. I thought, that's never going to work. But I thought, okay, he's got faith for it, and he collects board games, so he's got like hundreds. So he put this thing on. We did some graphics for it. We invited people. It's, again, not the whole church, just a niche thing. I was stunned. We've done 3 now. We've got another one coming up. They are hugely popular. I mean, we're not talking about hundreds of people, but the people who love board games come and they bring their friends. I mean, who would have known? But, you know, so it doesn't necessarily have to be generated by you. But obviously, if you're keen on something, then maybe that's an idea. Just start thinking creatively. Go and see the galleries that are in your town. Visit the local museum that's in your town, and then see what happens.
Brilliant. Brilliant, Lex. Thank you so much. Some wonderful kind of little bits of wisdom, insight there. Number one, I love that. We'll keep coming back to that. Learn about the city. And number two, think how you can make a specifically Christian contribution to the city and place that you're on. I imagine there's a constant left and right as you walk, left, right, between those two things. Listen, love, and speak. Lex, thanks for your time today.
Pleasure. Great to be with you as always.